And if you remember, we left off last week talking about what I'm calling the new nativism, and the idea that there's a kind of white resentment afoot in American politics today that has deep historical roots and has mutated, has been given a new life or been revived by recent demographic as well as political developments, and that it is a potent and I think in many ways distorting and destructive force in contemporary American politics. It is a re-articulation of a notion of what's sometimes called Herrenfolk democracy, the idea that democracy is exclusively for a privileged people who should be given exclusive citizenship, exclusive power, exclusive legal protection within the society, that this therefore helps us to square the circle of how it is that a democratic society can fail to afford full equal protection or full citizenship to certain groups of the people who would, it seems, otherwise be qualified for legal protection and political rights, and that it has moved primarily, though not exclusively, into a form of anti-immigrant politics, into demographic politics, into concern about the racial composition of the nation. And we saw a lot of evidence, I think, in the news last week that this kind of politics still has a very active role in contemporary American political developments. And so I will continue talking about this theme, but because it was a rich week in politics as well, I want to at least begin the lecture, we'll see how far we get, by talking about what's been happening in American politics and the relevance of the lens of analysis I'm trying to develop for understanding what's been happening in politics. And I'm actually going to pull out and suggest that really perhaps the most important thing that's happening in politics this week is not happening in the United States, but in fact happening in Glasgow. And I think, you know, we neglect this at our peril. It's a bit like the pandemic. We are perhaps fatigued with the need to continue to think about climate change, but the evidence is, I think, at this point so copious as to be unrefutable. We are suffering from rapidly accelerating and potentially catastrophic global climate change. And the time is ticking down on our capacity to avert true catastrophe, right? And so perhaps Glasgow, which is the right successor conference to the Paris Climate Conference that gave us the Paris Climate Accords, the Glasgow may be our best and last opportunity to really begin to change the course. And yet, I am not heartened by what's happening there. It's still only halfway through. There may be some breakthroughs, but you will note that neither China nor Russia sent their top level delegates or envoys to the conference, that their lack of deep participation immediately hamstrings the proceedings. And then the leaders of the world who are there, or their representatives, depending upon which day, which event we're talking about, also seem to be incapable of generating the will to commit to the policies that the urgency of the catastrophe we face makes necessary, right? And so I've shown you on the one hand the floor of the proceedings in Glasgow, and on the other hand, as you may have seen yesterday, I believe it's 100,000 protesters descended on Glasgow, actually took over the conference. That's Greta Thunberg at the front of the charge. Almost all of them are relatively young. And I think one of the things to point out, and I'll speak a little bit more about this, but the way in which youth have been radicalized around this issue, and the way in which this matches the data we're seeing in terms of research in social and medical psychology, suggesting that there is actually widespread depression among young people, widespread evidence of lack of psychological health related to the fact that they do not believe that the planet we are about to bequeath to them will be healthy enough to be habitable by the end of their natural lifespans, and that the idea of bringing a child into this world when all the projections indicate that within the natural lifetime of the next generation, right? If a child born today lives to 80, they die at the beginning of the 22nd century. And there's evidence that I've shown you before that the carrying capacity, that the amount of human life that Europe will be able to support if we stay on our current course in 2100 may be 1/10 of what it is today. That the 440 million people who live in Europe today may have to be reduced to 45 million if global sea levels rise and take away a significant portion of the territory, especially of southern and coastal Europe. If the amount of arable land is contracted substantially, if equatorial disease spreads as the climate gets warmer, etc., that how do you responsibly bring a child into a world that seems on the precipice of this kind of change, of really becoming substantially more dystopian? So it's not surprising that it's the young people at the forefront, the avant-garde of this protest movement, demanding that our leaders do more. I'm sorry, I should have shared with you, I didn't put a slide of the sculpture that an artist created of the world leaders debating climate change up to their necks in water, right? That as they seem to be just incapable of doing anything but talking, even as the evidence mounts all around them, that this is the most urgent issue of our generation, that we stand in the first time in human history at the cusp of actually making the planet uninhabitable, actually wiping humanity, not this civilization, this culture, this society, but the human species as such from the planet. And by the way, in the process, causing an extinction event of the kind that in the past had only been caused by extraterrestrial forces or major ice ages, right? And so to give you a sense of where we are and what needs to be accomplished, this is a simple diagram showing 2020 and then the projections for the end of the century, right, at 2020, a decade after the Paris Climate Accords. And I want to point out very quickly that we call Paris a climate accord as opposed to a climate treaty because it has no enforcement mechanism, right? And so although the governments of the world, 160 countries, pledged in Paris to reduce their climate emissions, the target in Paris was 2 degrees Celsius. A decade ago, that appeared like that was the highest level of global temperature increase we could tolerate without triggering truly catastrophic consequences. Today, a decade later, we have much greater understanding of the processes that are being released, the uncontrollable processes that we are releasing. A simple example is the melting of the polar ice caps, right? And the way in which, as that accelerates and occurs more quickly than we realize, the uh, ability of that large area of white ice to reflect solar energy back out into the galaxy instead of it being absorbed by water or earth or plants, which are much more absorbent, is radically diminished, right? And so that generates a potentially self-reinforcing cycle. There are similar things going on with methane being released from the ocean's floor or from permafrost. Without going into all the details, what seems clear is that we are in severe danger if we go up to 2 degrees. So the goal from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Research has been reduced from 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees as kind of the maximum tolerable amount of global heating we can safely sustain. Pre-Paris, right, we were admitting so much that we would vastly exceed that, maybe get up to 6 degrees Celsius. Paris, we made pledges to get us to 2 degrees, but as you can see, almost no country on the Earth has actually brought its emissions into conformity with its pledges. And even if they had done that, we would need to take much more aggressive measures. So when the protesters are protesting, they're protesting the failure to abide by our pledges and the inadequacy of our pledges and the seeming complacency in the face of impending disaster about our failure to do what we need to do. When we look at individual countries, and these are the big 4 largest emitters, we can see that the largest threat right now is China. If we were to look at the historical data, we would see that the United States and Europe are responsible for the vast majority of carbon dioxide already in the atmosphere. But if we look at the current rates of emission, China is putting in 14 gigatons of CO2 per year, right? And so that's a huge outpouring. And that if, right, China were to get to what it pledged, it would have to reduce that significantly. But if it were to get to the range that is compatible with 1.5 degrees Celsius maximum increase in temperature, it would have to reduce its emissions by almost 50%. And clearly, this is a place where the world needs to figure out how to generate leverage. And that leverage may be negative leverage. There will be sanctions, tariffs on Chinese goods if China does not come into conformity with these goals. But also, I would hope positive incentives for the Chinese, recognizing that there are good reasons that China wants to electrify its entire country, that the consumers in China want products that use greater electricity. And if we could assist the Chinese in converting its electrical sources from coal to more sustainable sources, especially solar and wind turbine, the benefit to the world would be substantial, right? Potentially life-saving, but also the economic knock-on effects of the largest country in the world developing the capacity. It would reduce the cost of sustainable forms of electricity for everyone in the world. And one thing is clear, right? In this decade, we have to move from a world where our reliance is on internal combustion engines and various forms of petroleum products to produce our energy to a world where practically everything operates on electricity, and the vast bulk of our sources of electrical energy are sustainable. Very quickly, the United States is obviously failing to meet its objectives as well, right? And needs to move to much more aggressive objectives. And let me just point out very quickly that one of the major impediments in legislation in Congress that would do more to address this is Joe Manchin of West Virginia, a coal economy, although less so than it used to be, but nevertheless, the idea of a transition away from coal is very threatening to very many voters in West Virginia. And here we begin to hit up against aspects of the politics of white resentment. And in particular, if, as I'll argue, this is certainly not a majority of the United States, probably not a majority of white people in the United States who are animated by the worst form of this politics, then one of the things that we need to be reckoning with is the way in which our constitutional structure amplifies the power of states where this kind of politics is powerful, right? And so we have an 18th century constitution, a constitution that incorporated the idea that the economies and the cultures of each of the states was sufficiently distinct that they needed the capacity to effectively alter the politics of the rest. The Senate is the mechanism by which that is supposed to occur. We live in a world where not only is the fate of the country, but the fate of the world perhaps hinges on what the voters of West Virginia allow their representatives to do. The idea that West Virginia is its own sovereign society that needs to be represented as such in the Senate seems catastrophically antiquated. And so just to think about for a moment, the United States, Europe is doing better. India is actually doing substantially better, I think, for economic reasons as well as policy reasons. And the economic reasons are not good reasons in terms of the way in which the pandemic has really dragged down the Indian economy. But as you can see, no society in the world, none of the big emitters at least, are where they need to be if we are going to keep climate change from really fundamentally altering life on this planet. I was going to point out to you, let me be very quick about this, that we could also look at another angle on this, which is what is happening in Brazil and Indonesia, the countries that contain the largest rainforests in the world. And right, the rainforests are the lungs of the world, to use the metaphor that's sometimes used. I think you've got to add the oceans to that as well. But places where carbon dioxide is potentially pulled out of the atmosphere via natural processes, right? We have not, and we aren't sure that we can develop man-made chemical processes to pull carbon dioxide efficiently out of the air. And so we continue to rely on nature to do this. And this then depends upon preserving the rainforests of the world, which are, depending upon the year, more or less subject to encroachment, as Brazil especially, but Indonesia as well, burns the forest, releasing the carbon dioxide they contain in order to transfer the land into agricultural uses, especially raising cattle, which might produce a tremendous amount of methane. And by the way, as the planet heats, the delicate patterns of ecology that the rainforests depend upon are increasingly fragile and in danger, right? And there's worry that the rainforests of the Amazon could be converted to savanna over the next 20, 30 years if these changes continue, just again, to get at the urgency of the problem and the difficulty that we seem to be facing in mustering the will to do anything meaningful about this at the moment. All right, so I'm going to now move out of climate change. If anybody has a question or a thought before I push on, okay, but feel free to unmute yourself and just ask it. But I'm going to continue. Oh, please.
I do have a question.
Yeah, go ahead. Who is that?
It's John Campbell. I'm sorry, I don't have my video on. I take your point and agree that the world has to take that kind of joint action or we are in effect doomed. But leaving that completely aside, I'd just like to ask what you think the chances are the world will be able to take effective joint action in this area. Do you think, just as an objective observer looking on from Mars, would you say the chances are around 75%, around 50%, or around 10%? I'd say 10% is a high estimate myself. I don't think there's a chance in hell the world is going to do anything about this. But if you really are optimistic that somehow or other this giant collective action problem can be solved somehow, I'd like to hear what your guess is as to what the chances are.
So my optimistic guess is something like 20-25%. And what that means, of course, is that there's a 3/4 chance that we're doomed. And that accounts for the depression, the desperation, the anger of a younger generation, right? Having said that, and I'll start with the idea that these numbers are arbitrary, right? How do we pick a number out of that air for what the odds are? One of the things I'll just point out is that there is the phenomenon of gestalt shift in politics, right? That what seemed impossible 5 years ago becomes somewhat probable now, and the received common sense 5 years later, right? And so if you would have asked me in 1989 what the likelihood was that gay marriage would be the law of the land in the United States, I would have probably said around 10%. And yet 10 years later, it was the law of the land, right? And so change does happen sometimes in unforeseen and unpredictable ways. And I'll just point out that the generational divide on this issue is so extreme, right? And I was listening to something today, and I have to admit, it caught me a little unaware that the percentage of Americans who call themselves evangelicals has declined radically in the last decade, from around 23% to around 14%. And that it appears that evangelical stances on homosexuality, traditional gender relations, race, and environment have substantially eroded the number of young people who are willing to take up the faith of their parents, right? And so one of the mechanisms via which gestalt change occurs is via generational turnover, right? It's not generational turnover alone. It's also when the younger generation manages to convince the older generation, you're not getting it, you're not understanding it. And typically this occurs by humanizing the issue. And the way I tried to do this in today's lecture is to raise the question: if you were 25 years old today, do you feel that you could responsibly have a child? And what would it do to you psychologically to think that it was unethical to participate in the reproduction of human life, given that we can't think that there's a good likelihood that the world will be sustainable, habitable across a full human lifespan for somebody born next year, right? And if more and more people begin to think about this issue in that way, I guess I could see minds changing quickly. And part of this is the narrative power of young people saying, this is substantially undermining the quality of my life. The other thing is the punishment that nature increasingly inflicts on us on an annual basis. I know you all live in a place where the world gets transformed into something resembling a Boschian hellscape, right? You know, the sun is choked out of the sky by ash and smoke reliably a few times a year, right? And so maybe as the extreme weather, the fires, the droughts, the apocalyptic dimensions of climate change become increasingly salient, palatable. I'm sorry, that's not the right word, inescapable, right? That we just can't put our heads in the sand about this anymore. Maybe the change will occur more rapidly than we think, but our political systems are not designed for rapid change. Our leaders are very short-term in their focus. We do have a collective action problem, and as long as part of the world won't solve this issue, it removes the incentive for the rest of the world to solve it. So the obstacles, right, are difficult to surmount, and that's why, despite having just laid out the scenario, I'm still suggesting there's only a 25% chance that this will happen. Thank you, John. I think that's a good way to frame this. Anybody else want to continue along this depressing topic? No. Okay. Then let us move on. I want next to turn to the contemporary political news that is domestic news from the United States. Give me just a moment. I'm noticing that my computer doesn't seem to be taking a charge, and I think I know why that is. I've got to just do one thing here for a second, which is to get my browser turned off, because it seems, yeah, it says I've got 15% power. I don't think that's enough to get us through the next half an hour. Give me just a moment. Okay, I got it done. Hopefully my computer starts behaving itself now. Next thing to be focused on in terms of contemporary American politics, and I want to make sure you guys are seeing the screen again, right? The data on jobs and salaries.
Yes.
Okay, good. So we got both good news on jobs for October. That's right, preliminary data, and some revisions upward in the job picture from the last couple months. And I think one of the things to notice is that when the Congressional Budget Office predicted a year ago when we would get to the place where we are right now, they predicted that it would take another 2+ years to get there, right? And so the fact that the stuff that we were talking about in a couple lectures ago about how effective the federal stimulus or anti-coronavirus legislation was in limiting poverty and ultimately, I think, thereby promoting economic growth is important, right? And we really have to notice that the economy is recovering much more quickly than we anticipated. And please note that wages are up dramatically, right? That's 15% increase over the last couple years in many sectors in our economy. Now, if we adjust that for cost of living and take into account that inflation seems to be stronger than it's been in the past, this comes down by around half, right, in terms of the actual value of these increased wages. But the economy is doing better now than most anybody realistically could have hoped or expected that it would have been doing. And one of the questions is whether or not Joe Biden, the Democrats, more broadly speaking, federal policy that aggressively responds to poverty and economic downturn will get credit is still to be seen, because obviously we did see losses in the Democratic stronghold of Virginia last week that suggest that people have lost patience with Joe Biden, with the limited legislative accomplishments of the Democrats up until this point, with a pandemic that shows no sign of weakening its grip on our public health or on our economy, right? And so this might be glass half full, half empty kind of scenario. It might alternatively be a question of whether the Democrats can effectively communicate their message that this is actually not as good as we want it to be, needed to be, but better than it would have been, substantially better, and some credit is needed as a result. All right, so now can I get my slide to advance? Yes, and of course the other big piece of news here is that the infrastructure bill, the so-called bipartisan infrastructure bill that passed the Senate in August, passed the House of Representatives last night, will probably be signed into law today. I'm not watching the news. Maybe it already has been, right? That this is a genuinely bipartisan piece of legislation. Yes, it's rather slender, the support that the Republicans gave to it in the House of Representatives. But remember, a substantial portion of Republicans also voted for it in the Senate. And it is a delivery on a promise that Joe Biden made, which is that the idea of some form of bipartisan governance and legislating policymaking can be revived despite the dramatic polarization of the country. And as you can see, I've listed the details here, right? This is a $1.2 trillion piece of legislation that involves $550 billion in new spending. The other half of it is from reappropriating money that has already been allocated. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the actual cost and increased deficit will be around $250 billion. So around half of it will pay for itself via increased growth, employment, and taxation. That there's a lot for so-called hard infrastructure, bridges, roads, the electrical grid, rail services, dramatic expansion of broadband, especially to rural communities, but also speeding up the broadband for the rest of the country, water infrastructure, and after the catastrophic results in Flint, where lead got into the water, the need for this is clear. Environmental remediation as we deal with a heating planet and more extreme weather, and also flooding resiliency, money to modernize transit, and a fair bit of that is still in the pending legislation, and as you can see, other measures as well. Depending on how you view this, if you view the Affordable Care Act as having been an infrastructure bill, then this is the largest infrastructure expenditure or expansion in a decade. If you don't view the Affordable Care Act as infrastructure, this is the largest expenditure on infrastructure in a generation. This is an important accomplishment. It's not all the way there yet. Obviously, there's another bill looming, and I'll just refresh your memory that in order to get bipartisan support, I'm sorry the slide advanced, most of what Biden originally proposed, most of what the Democrats led by Bernie Sanders proposed was cut from this bill, right? I don't know if you can see, but that's a $560 billion, 300, almost 400 billion, another 400 billion. And if you go over to what was actually passed, zero, 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 right? So 3/4 of the bill was cut away and now is put into the shrinking but still large Build Back Better or reconciliation or safety net bill. I don't need to go through all of this with you, but I want to drive home, right? Climate change measures, universal pre-K, child tax credit, the Affordable Care Act subsidies, affordable housing. What we've been looking at together for the last few weeks is the idea that we have actually driven poverty down in this country temporarily in a way that is expiring, in a way that is dangerous given the current economic conditions for it to lapse, but is lapsing. We could do this in a more permanent way if this legislation were to pass. And again, to come back to the frame of white resentment politics, we're about to turn to what happened in Virginia. But in a sense, it's Joe Manchin, it's Kristen Sinema, it's senators who are Democrats, but who represent constituencies where the kinds of politics we're talking about are popular and powerful, who stand in the way of this legislation being passed, and whose constituents will be damaged if it isn't passed, who will suffer more on average than the kind of people who are supporting this legislation. So let's talk about Virginia. Let's talk about last Tuesday. Let's talk about the elections. And I think the place to start is with the waning popularity of Joe Biden and the drag that this put on Democratic candidates throughout the country. As you can see, Joe Biden is inverse of where he was a few months ago, right? And part of the issue here, of course, is the coronavirus came raging back with the Delta variant. I'll speak about this a little bit more in a moment, but the United States still
alert from
at
Google password required
60% vaccination, right? That's the people who have full vaccination status. And I believe it's 57% to be precise. The threshold that we seem to be learning is required to really bring the coronavirus under control, as opposed to being on the roller coaster we're on, where it goes up and down, is around 70%. So we've got some distance to cover. Joe Biden promised in June to get this under control. In July, celebrated it. Clearly, he is being held accountable for the fact that it hasn't, in fact, happened. Similarly, although there's some good economic news, don't lose track of the fact that we're still down over 4 million jobs from where we were before the coronavirus hit us, right? And so the thing to see is, I think, as we try to draw the lessons for what happened in this off-year election for next year, for the congressional elections, is the Democrats still have an advantage in overall polling on the so-called generic ballot. Do you support a Democrat or a Republican? Though it's a reduced advantage over what they have had of late. And of course, with gerrymandering, but in general, with the way elections are structured in the United States, the overall number matters less than district by district projections. It's a little early for that, but based on this level of popularity, based on this relatively slight advantage, it appears that the Democrats are in danger of losing substantial margins in both the House and the Senate, and that the result will be that this is the only window they have to legislate. And on the other hand, if they build on the success of last night and also pass the Build Back Better bill, one of the questions will be, how quickly does this policy begin to get implemented? How quickly do we feel the effects, both in terms of macroeconomics and in terms of individual economic situation? And if this legislation gets passed soon, and if it actually begins to bear economic fruit, then it's possible that Joe Biden might get greater approval. The Democrats might have a somewhat better prospect. The other big wild card in this, right, and you can see again a kind of glass half empty, half full scenario. On the one hand, we clearly have come out of the disastrous spike in coronavirus transmission and deaths that was characteristic of the early fall, late summer. And on the other hand, it is still the case that 70,000 new cases are developing in this country a day, that 1,200 people are dying a day. And so, although this is increasingly concentrated in areas with high proportions of the population unvaccinated, it is having countrywide effects in terms of what it's doing to the economy, in terms of what it's doing to the supply chain, in terms of what it's doing to the inflation rate, and in terms, frankly, of what it's doing to us psychologically. And that there is a malaise that has set in as the idea that this does not appear to have a clear end date, that we can specify the goal of 70%. And as childhood vaccines now become available, as people 12 to 5 are now qualified by the federal government to get vaccination, let us hope that the vaccination rate will go up, that the transmission rate will go down, that as a result, the deaths and hospitalizations will go down as well. And please note, even in the areas where death rates are very high, 75, 80% of the people who are succumbing to this disease are unvaccinated, right? And so there are things we can do to bring this under control, but we also, I think, need leadership that doesn't say this will go away, but that we can, in fact, sustain ourselves, our economy, see a future in which the coronavirus is not pandemic but endemic, that it's like the flu, that it's something that we have to live with, but that it doesn't disrupt our society, our economy, our lives, our psychology to the degree that it is right now. Turning finally to what happened, and I'm going to use Virginia as an example on Tuesday. I think that the most important statistic here looks at how people who disapproved of Joe Biden, and please note that's a majority of Americans right now, right? That they voted in a relatively close but not tight election in a blue state, a state that has been majority Democratic for over a decade, the state of Virginia, a state in which the majority of the population is suburban and a high level of college education. The people who are not happy with Joe Biden voted for Youngkin, 90% to 10%. The people who approved of Joe Biden voted for the Democrat, McAuliffe, 93% to 6%. And I think the thing that's really worrying for the Democrats is the way in which their support from college educated whites was substantially eroded from where it was. And then if you look at where these people are concentrated geographically and how much better Youngkin did than Biden, right? And that he got 8% or more of the Biden vote coming his way in relatively well-off suburban districts. This is a very alarming side sign for the Democrats. And please note, right, that Youngkin managed, I think, what is increasingly the recipe for success at the state level for Republicans who are not running in deep red states, which was to distance himself from Donald Trump, from big lie politics, which works for his dyed in the wool base, right? For the people who say, Trump is the savior for the country, then the election being stolen from Trump is a very powerful way to mobilize them. But for the college educated whites, it's not a successful strategy. Youngkin did not participate in that strategy, but he did find another issue, or perhaps a couple other issues. He spoke a lot about election integrity, right? He spoke a lot about critical race theory in the schools. And what we're seeing with the polling data and the interviews is that the critical race theory was actually a very powerful issue, that a lot of white people said, we don't like critical race theory being taught in our schools. When you interviewed them and asked them, well, do you know that critical race theory is being taught in our schools? Yes, right? But they couldn't give any evidence. And I think the really illuminating thing is, do you know what critical race theory is? And the vast majority of people interviewed on this said, no, but I know I don't like it, right? And so, if we want to go at this from a kind of analytical perspective and say, obviously critical race theory is not being taught in the schools in Virginia, right? That's almost laughable as an assertion of fact. Fine, but it misses the point, right? It misses the point that this was an effective way of saying, here's a peg to hang the politics of white racial resentment on, right? If you are unhappy that the country is taking the direction that it's taking, that the main candidates for president for the Democratic Party in the last election coalesced around the idea of reparations for slavery for African Americans, right? That they're tearing down the statutes of, remember, we're in Virginia now, of the Confederacy, right? That the previous Democratic president was African American, that the current vice president is a biracial woman of African American and Southeast Asian descent, all right? Or I should say Asian descent, that these are signs that the country is moving in a direction that make a lot of white people uncomfortable. Here's an issue that lets you not be as vulgarly racist as Donald Trump was, to not have to be in favor of separating children from their parents on the border, but nevertheless allows you to view the Republican candidate as somebody who is giving vent to the discomfort and anxiety that you feel about the direction the country is headed in and your place within it. This is a powerful recipe for success for the Republicans in 2022. And I think many people are taking note, and the Democrats are understandably frightened about the prospects for going down in defeat as a result. So I'm just going to say I'm having power problems with my computer. I hope that it doesn't cut off. I'm warning you that I'm getting a warning message. I can't seem to make it charge. I'm going to continue. I want to now transition back to where we were, the big topic for the lecture. But before I do that, does anybody have any questions about kind of this week in politics and the economy, the topics we've been talking about so far? Then let me move on. And by all means, if you have a comment, just unmute yourself and share it. But the next thing I want to talk about is what we've been talking about together for a couple of weeks now. And I'll start with the idea that the level of increase in poverty that we anticipated, right, as a result of what the coronavirus did to our economy, did not in fact happen. And in fact, the opposite happened, right? We saw a radical reduction in poverty. We saw, in fact, the largest reduction in poverty in the United States in the last 50 years. And the explanation for this, I hope, is clear, right? Which is to say that whereas a growing economy has at best a marginal impact on rates of poverty, and this is because the benefits of economic growth are so unilaterally concentrated in the wealthiest people in this country, that trickle down occurs, but it occurs very slowly and at a very constricted rate. That if we want to really fight poverty, we know now what to do. Pass federal legislation. Don't rely on just economic growth. And that the result of the reduction in poverty was a reduction in economic anxiety. And that makes all of us better problem solvers. It makes all of us more patient, less aggressive, better parents as a result. That another big result of this is that it reduced depression. It affected the psychology of the entire country in ways that potentially may increase the overall mortality levels, the overall life expectancy in the country. These are powerful levers with powerful effects, not only in terms of economics, but also in terms of psychology. And that in a sense, this helps us to really see what should be obvious already, which is if we measure poverty correctly, the Great Society programs from the 1960s did drive poverty down. It's only if we don't take into account the non-cash transfers that we see poverty seeming to be relatively stable. Once we take them into account, poverty has actually been reduced by federal policy consistently over the last 50 years. Again, the difference between the official poverty rates, right, which were driven down by about a quarter if we just look at that data over the first 50 years of the Great Society programs. But if we also look at the value of non-cash transfers, refundable tax credits, which have just increased dramatically, using a more accurate index for cost of living, what we see is poverty was in fact reduced by maybe 75% over this period. And so this indicates that we could live in a more humane, a less mean society if we could muster the will, but we are not there yet. And there's signs that a lot of us are very vulnerable right now to cutting off the aid that these policies have put in place, that the moratorium on repaying student loans may still be in place, but almost everything else has expired. And that the result is that roughly a third of Americans are in harm's way right now, at least a third of American families with children, either facing housing or food hardship in the immediate present. And so then we get to the question, and let me not focus so much on growing inequality and lack of mobility, the decline of the laborer's share, the decline of unionization, the effects of globalization, the effects of concentrated corporate power, the decreased progressivity of the taxes in the United States, the resulting disparity in wealth, right? I hope all of this is review. What I want to get us back to in the last few minutes is the politics of white resentment. And I pointed out to you a couple of weeks ago, there's a robust literature on the way in which there's been a public wage associated with whiteness. It's not necessarily a material wage. It's what W.E.B. Du Bois called a psychological wage. It's the idea of a secure social standing that gives one a sense of inherent social superiority over a defined subordinate minority group, African Americans primarily, that bolstered the status, the sense of belonging, the sense of empowerment of many whites, and that has been eroded over the last 50 years. And a wide array of literature shows that when you couple increased inequality with increased status anxiety, it is very unhealthy, that it increases mortality, suicide, anxiety, heart disease, drug overdose, but it also depresses mental health and wellness, increases mental illness, decreases educational outcomes, decreases trust, increases homicides, that in all of these ways, our society is getting worse, and that this is really concentrated in white people of a certain age, in their middle ages, their mid 40s to their mid 50s, people who grew up with greater expectations of mobility that have been shattered by what's going on with us, that it hasn't affected Black people nearly as much, in part because Black people never had these expectations to begin with, right? So they haven't been disappointed. And in terms of social status, the flip side of the diminished value of white social status in the United States is that Black social status has become less of a liability. That doesn't mean that it isn't still a liability, but it is less of a liability in 2021 than it was in 1960 or 1970 by far. And then I introduced us to literature that really focuses on what I refer to as the paradox of the politics of white resentment, following Arlie Hochschild and others, the idea that white people, in order to preserve their sense of status, of dignity, of being contributing, hardworking members of society, not relying on the government, which they increasingly see as an agent of preference for people who are unlike them, are refusing to support politicians who support the expansion of the federal government, or even the maintenance of the relatively weak social safety net that we have in our country right now. They see their dignity as caught up with scaling back or limiting the role of the federal government in providing welfare, in regulating industry, in protecting the environment. And therefore, in many ways, they are voting in ways that damage their material interests because they prioritize their interests in social dignity and standing in the 21st century over their material interests. And I tried to persuade you, I hope, that this actually makes sense, that this is a position that you can understand, that it's intelligible and maybe even sympathetic, that not the way in which the sense of dignity has been secured, or the idea that the government is not on our side, but the idea that, generally speaking, you might prioritize your dignity over your material interests if you perceived the policies that support your material interests as being hostile to your dignity. And then finally, let me just to set things up for next week, point out to you that I then started to introduce a new body of literature. And this is a body of literature that complicates the picture by looking at racial politics not only through the lens of Black and white, but by looking at it in terms of the interaction of European Americans with Indigenous Americans, with Mexicans, who for much of our history controlled much of the territory that is now the United States, right? And who remained in that territory after we acquired it, but remained in a very peculiar status legally and a very precarious status socially. That if we look at Asian Americans as well, we get a more complicated sense of both white privilege, white citizenship as a marker of racial status, and then the directions that the politics of white resentment take in the 21st century. And I promise I will get there next week, assuming we don't get overwhelmed with more current politics in the United States or the world. But I want to really focus on why it is that in the 21st century, white nativism, white racial resentment politics seems to be so vehemently directed against immigration.
Hello.
And that's where I hope the new literature I introduce and discuss helps us to focus in the coming week's discussion. Let me stop there. I'm glad to see that my computer actually held out. And why don't we open things up for discussion? Who'd like to start us out with a thought or a comment? Either on what happened in Virginia, or what's happening with the economy or the virus, or what's happening with the politics of white resentment in the country. Dale, if you're trying to speak, you're muted. You'd have to hold your spacebar down or push that little microphone icon in the lower left of your Zoom screen. No, anybody else?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Doris.
Is there information on, I don't know, let me go another way. I had a discussion with a friend, and what was pointed out was that we people of color, our lives have gotten better. You know, as we look back to our parents. Now that percentage, is that equal to the white race also, that their lives have gotten better, or what is that percent? Is there any information about how that compares?
Yes, there is, Doris. And so let me start with the need to disaggregate. So if I've got it right, Doris, you count yourself as Asian American?
I'm sorry, say that again?
You count yourself as Asian American, do I have that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Right, so the situation with Asian Americans is different from the situation with African Americans or Latino Americans, right? And by the way, the situation for Asian Americans is very different for the Japanese or the Chinese than it is for the Hmong or the Vietnamese, right? And so if what you want to do is those kinds of comparisons, we have to begin getting much more fine-grained. I'm doing some research right now, and I'm stunned to find this, that African Americans actually find their wealth decrease proportionately to white Americans if they get a college education. Right? You understand what I just said, right? It's the opposite of what you would expect. Get a college education and your wealth should go up, right? Well, in the contemporary United States, getting a college education involves going into debt. And it turns out that African Americans go into more than twice as much debt as white Americans do, in part because the family lacks the resources, so they rely more on student loans. But it's also the case, and again, this is where I think the research is advancing right now, an understanding of what the level of debt you have does to your prospects in life, depending also on what your family resources are, right? And so most African Americans, first of all, are not able to rely on family wealth in a way that allows them to get assistance purchasing a home, right? And so the level of debt that they go in to go to college actually just closes the door on their ability to acquire a house in their 20s or 30s, right? And so that is increasing then the wealth gap. And in addition to that, many African Americans who get a college education and who start to earn better find that they have to do the opposite thing that white Americans who get a college education do, which is to transfer wealth up to the next generation, as opposed to having wealth transferred down from the next generation, right? So white Americans get assistance buying a home, get assistance paying off their student loans, eventually get an inheritance. And I want to be careful. This is not all white Americans, right? But this is typical white Americans who get a college education. Typical Black Americans who get a college education end up having to assist their parents to keep them housed, to pay their medical bills. And therefore, even if their earning potentials go up, their wealth is not necessarily increased as a result, right? And so, Doris, I haven't answered your question, but I'm beginning to just try to point to the complexity and sometimes the counterintuitive things we would have to consider to answer your question, right? Is there a greater share of African Americans who are college educated today than there were 50 years ago? Absolutely. Does that mean their income prospects are greater? Does it mean that their work satisfaction is greater? Does it mean that their social status is greater? Yes. Does it mean that the wealth gap is closed? It turns out not only is the answer to that no, but the opposite. It's upside down, that the wealth gap has increased for college educated Blacks relative to college educated whites. And so it's just very hard to give a general answer to that question, Doris. And I'll just add one more thing, which is we know about wealth. That one of the things that it does is it increases intergenerationally, right? We have a stable, stubborn, persistent wealth gap between Blacks and whites in this society. Typical figure is around 14 to 1. White families are around 14 times as wealthy as Black families. I don't think there's any reason we should expect that number to diminish. And in fact, there's good reasons to expect it to increase unless we have deliberate and targeted policies. And so, again, this is really complicated. Are African Americans getting educational opportunities? Are Latino Americans, are Asian Americans experiencing greater social mobility, greater opportunities in the 21st century than they were in, let's say, the middle of the 20th century? Again, I think there's no doubt that that's the case. Is this in fact closing the gaps between them? I think we have to be very careful before we jump to that conclusion. Does that help, Doris, a little bit at least?
Yes, thank you. I think that I hear, well, we're better off than we were before. I mean, we just hear that.
Yeah. And in obvious senses, it's true, right? It's still in living memory that Japanese Americans were interred in World War II, right? That anti-Asian slurs were just part of the accepted vocabulary of America during World War II and during the Korean War and during the Vietnam War, right? And so, there are signs of progress, but the question of whether we're on an overall progressive trajectory, things are just going to keep getting better, I think we've got to be very careful in jumping to that assumption. I can't tell. Joanne, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
I was wondering if there are still the restrictions that there were for so long about where somebody could buy a house. Neighborhoods were restricted on the basis of race.
Not legally. And please note that if you're talking about racial covenants, right? Which basically is a part of the deed to the house that says the current owner can only sell the house to white people or cannot sell the house to black people, right? Which the federal government encouraged the American real estate industry to put in place once it became illegal, unconstitutional, to have simple municipal statutes that said no black people can move to this area, right? The Supreme Court struck that down in the 1930s. In the late 1930s, all the way through the 1950s, the federal government encouraged the real estate industry to put those covenants into people's deeds. But as early as the 1940s, the Supreme Court also said those covenants are unenforceable, but they're still there. My parents' home in Sonoma, California has a racial covenant on it, right? And it's actually expensive. It costs, I looked into it, it costs around $10,000 to get the deed reworked, to get the racial covenant taken off of it. So it's unenforceable. But if you're uninformed about this and you see that covenant on the deed, it may lead you to wonder whether it's legal to sell the house to African-American family. So having said all of that, the mechanisms for legal exclusion of people by race are no longer available. Their vestiges are still there. And in ways that maybe I'll come back to at some point, and there's some really interesting research being done today about how all the way through the 1970s and the 1980s, predatory practices on the part of the real estate industry, the banking industry, mortgage industry continued to segregate American houses, American neighborhoods, and contributed to the preservation of the wealth gap as well, by essentially selling African Americans homes that they could not afford, that were so poorly maintained that it was impossible for them to both pay the mortgage and maintain the home, and refusing to sell them homes in better maintained, more affluent, more white neighborhoods. So there are not legal mechanisms, but there are powerful structural mechanisms maintaining segregation and housing inequality in the United States today. Flossie, are you trying to speak? You're still muted. I can't tell. I thought I saw you light up there for a second. It is 15 minutes over time. My computer has been very cooperative. This gives me the opportunity to say goodbye as opposed to just being cut off. Lovely, as always, to be with you guys. And